Hey everybody, this is Mike with Free Roaming Photography, and in this video I'm going to give you 10 tips for excellent wildlife photos. And just a reminder, I do offer private photography workshops in Grand Teton and Yellowstone National Park, so if you want to learn firsthand with me, check out the link in the description below. And also, if you're not comfortable with manual mode, you're going to want to check out this video real quick because it is vital that you understand how to use manual mode in order to get the most out of these tips and be familiar with your settings. So, without further ado, let's jump in. So number one is you always want to use the proper aperture. And with a lot of wildlife photos, this is going to mean opening up the aperture as much as possible, which results in a lower f number. So the aperture is that f number scale. And you want to get as low as you can, which is determined from within the lens. So it all depends on your lens's capabilities. Some will go down to f5.6, some 6.3, some 4.0. So ideally, you'll have a lens that can open up really big. So something like 4.0 or 5.6. That will help you pop out that subject from the background and increase that depth of field, which results in more dramatic photos. Now this also depends on how close your subject is. If it's filling up the entire frame, or at least most of it, you'll probably want to pull that aperture back to something like f8, because maybe accidentally it focuses on some hairs that are around the eye. If you pull back and focus on an f8, you'll have the eye still in focus, which is what you always want in focus. When you're shooting wildlife, that's the main thing, is to keep the eye in focus. If it's filling up the frame, you want to preserve some of that depth in and around that eye. If you're getting that much of the animal, then even at f8, you're still going to get great depth receding into its body. Whereas if you have that animal and it's not quite filling up the frame and you just have a nice portrait with some nice brush or something like that around it, then you want to stop down as much as you can to separate it from that background. Number two, and one I like to always preach, is to get eye level with the animal. No matter what it is, whether it's a moose or a bird, anything that you're shooting, you want to be eye level with it, because what this does is this puts more distance behind the animal and whatever's behind it. If you're shooting down at it, you decrease that depth because the ground's going to be right behind it. Whereas if you get eye level with it, you increase that depth behind it because you're putting that much more space behind the subject and the background. So that's one of the most vital tricks that I like to use. Even if you don't have one of those big f4 lenses, those big primes, you can fake that look by putting more distance behind the subject and the background. And you do that by getting eye level, or at least as close as you can to it. Similarly, with number three, avoid shooting down at subjects. For reasons we just touched on, you don't want to decrease that depth. And when you're shooting down at something, you reduce the amount of distance between the background and the animal. On top of that, the more downward you shoot, the more you can tell it's not really that dynamic of a shot. There are, of course, exceptions. Don't ever pass up a good opportunity just because it's not ideal. In general, if you can control the situation, you don't want to be shooting down at something. You want to be more eye level. Number four is to embrace cloudy weather. A lot of people look at a cloudy sky, or maybe there's some rain showers or something in the area, and they think it's not worth shooting because you don't have the bright sunlight. It's actually the opposite. Cloudy days are amazing for wildlife photography because what that does is that diffuses all the sunlight and creates a more even exposure all around the animal. This works out great for post-processing because this allows you to bring out a lot more color and a lot more contrast and dynamic range within the animal and its fur or the feathers or whatever it is you are looking at. So if there's clouds, definitely head out and do some wildlife photography. You'll be surprised by the results you get. Similarly, embrace sunrise and sunset. A lot of people don't want to get up for sunrise because it's early in the morning, but that's going to be one of your best times to shoot, as is sunset. Because what happens is as the sun is low on the horizon, it's not quite as bright as when it's in the midday, where you get a lot of contrast between the highlights and the shadows. A lot of times it's too much contrast to get a nice shot with that kind of exposure. So it's sunrise and sunset, or at least those times around it, you get a much softer light, and the contrast between the highlights and the shadows isn't nearly as dramatic. And in addition to being just a more beautiful light, you get much softer highlights with those shadows, so you get a more balanced exposure overall. So this is why wildlife photographers love being out at sunrise and sunset. It's the ideal lighting. You get nice long shadows, you get a warm light, and there's not a lot of contrast to try to balance out in post-processing or anything like that. It's just a beautiful full exposure regardless of what you're shooting. Number 6 is always aim for the eye. And we touched on this earlier, but this is a really important tip because this establishes the connection between the viewer, whoever's looking at the photo, and the subject within the photo, no matter what kind of animal it is. If you can capture that eye in focus, that's immediately what's going to draw people into your photo, and that's how they're going to try to connect with it. So you really want to make sure that eye is in focus. A lot of modern cameras have some incredible software built in to allow you to focus directly in on the eye, and it'll keep tracking that eye regardless of where the animal moves. So that's definitely something worth looking into. But if you don't have a modern camera that has that kind of software, you can set your focal point to something small to make sure you're zeroing in on the eye, because if you set it to a wider area where it's going to try to pick a focal point anywhere, it might pick the nose, it might pick some contrasting fur or feathers, and you really want to make sure you zero in on that eye to make sure that that stays in focus so that your viewer, whoever looks at it, can create a really good connection with the subject. Now, number 7 is one of my favorite tips, and that is if the subject is really far away, pull back and capture more of the environment, more of the landscape. What a lot of people want to do is they want to try to zoom in as close as they can. And if you're photographing, let's say, a deer and it's 150 yards away, you're not going to get a close-up of that shot. No matter how good of a lens you have, it's not going to be close up. The ideal thing to do in that situation is to pull back and look at its surroundings and compose a good landscape shot using what's available. So in that situation, you might have some mountains, you might have some forest, anything like that. You can pull back and kind of reduce the scale of that animal so that it's visible and it's part of that landscape, but you're not necessarily trying to make that the entire subject, because in that case, the subject is the relationship between that animal and its environment. And those usually wind up being really powerful landscape shots because you're putting an animal in that environment that creates more of a relationship, not just with the viewer, but also that animal with its home and its habitat. In that situation, you're going to want to pull back that aperture to something like f8 or f11, maybe even f16. And what that'll do is that'll preserve more depth throughout the entire scene, because when the animal's that far away, you don't need to try to pop it out from its background. Instead, you want to create that landscape, so you want to capture everything in focus. To do that, you need to close down that aperture a little bit. And if there's not much in the foreground, you could get away with f8, but if there's some foreground elements you want to include, definitely stop it down to f11 or more. And that is just part of the reality of wildlife photography. Sometimes that animal is not going to be right next to you to get those nice big full frame shots. And it really makes a nice complement to have when you have the close-up shots, but you also have its entire environment, so you can see that animal both as an intimate portrait as well as roaming through its natural habitat. Now, number 8 is to make sure you have a fast enough shutter speed. A lot of photos get ruined because the shutter speed is too slow. So that's something you really need to keep an eye on. And it doesn't have to be a lot of fast action. It doesn't have to be a cheetah running across the scene. It can just be a bear lumbering along. It can be a moose walking. It can be a bird just turning its head. A lot of this stuff happens a little quicker than it looks. And so you want to make sure you have a shutter speed that can freeze that action, because if you have this beautiful portrait of an animal, but that leg is just blurred because it was moving, that shot is essentially unusable because it's just too distracting to just have one big thing out of focus. So for larger mammals, you can get away with something slower, but just to be on the safe side, I would recommend at least 1/500th of a second or quicker. What that does is give you a little bit of a safety net in case it's going from a walk and it decides to start trotting a little quicker or something like that. You're ready for that action. You don't have to adjust too much. If you can't get around it, you can do something a little bit slower, like 1/320th of a second, 1/200th of a second maybe, but I wouldn't go much slower than that. You know, there's going to be certain situations where the lighting's just not available, things like that. But with the way denoise software is these days, it's worth cranking up the ISO and just making sure you have that shutter speed, because you can't fix a blurry photo, but you can fix noise if you have to. And similarly, if you're going for birds in flight, you're going to need something much quicker, something like 1/2000th of a second or quicker. And again, same thing, you can get away with a little bit slower, but you don't want to go much more than that, especially if you're shooting for smaller birds where the wings just move so rapidly. You need something really fast to freeze that action. Number 9 is one of the most vital tips in creating a powerful composition, and that is to avoid background distractions. And a lot of times you'll see pictures of a bear or something, but there's so many trees and branches just kind of in the way, you almost can't even find where the animal is. And so you really want to try to wait and see if that animal will be a little more cooperative and come out to a little bit more of a clearing so that you can get a nicer, cleaner shot without so many distracting elements in front. So this is where coming down back to eye level comes into play. That will blur the background out more, and that'll make for a less distracting background. But even so, there still might be some elements, and you'll want to wait until that animal is free of any other obstructions to create a more powerful image. And a lot of times this might be other animals. If you're capturing, let's say, elk in a herd, if you have another elk right behind it or in front of it, it can kind of get in the way and disrupt the majesty of that animal just standing there by itself. So you can move over a little bit to see if that helps. You can wait for them to walk a little bit. Whatever the case, you want that animal free from as many distractions as possible so that you can isolate them and create a more powerful portrait that way. And then last but not least, number 10 is wait for interesting behavior. And this is where that cliche of wildlife photographers needing a lot of patience comes into play. Let's say you're driving along and you pull up on an animal and it's just feeding on the ground. You can get shots of it, but those are the least interesting shots. A bear eating grass on the ground is probably the least interesting shot of a bear. Just like a moose with its head in the bushes is not that compelling. What you want to do is wait and see if that animal does something more interesting. And in this case, it doesn't necessarily need to be something like a bear chasing prey. It can just be as simple as that bear picking up its head. It can be that moose pulling out of its bush to look around for a little bit. That already is a much more interesting photo than an animal with its head down. And that goes back to number 6, is aiming for the eye. If their head is down, it's likely obstructed and you're not going to be able to see the eye very well, and it's not going to give something for people to connect to. So if you wait for them to pick their head up, all of a sudden the eye is visible, they have an expression on their face, they might be doing something. And just as likely, if you wait a little bit longer, it's very likely they'll walk somewhere else. You can get them walking. They might try to cross a body of water like a creek or a pond or something like that. Or especially when it's mating season and they start trying to smell the air, you can catch some of the males doing the Flehmen response, which is when they curl their upper lip up and they try to get a better scent of the air. That creates a much more interesting image, and it creates a much more interesting behavior. So those are 10 tips that I use to get excellent wildlife photos. And if you agree with any or disagree, definitely leave me a note down in the comments. And if you have any other questions or comments, leave them down below. And if you want to come out with me on a workshop where we'll practice all this in the field in Grand Teton or Yellowstone National Park, look up the link in the description down below. And be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. And thanks for watching, and happy trails.